Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are actually kind of ending our founding era, if you will, to get a little Taylor Swift because she's been in the news quite a bit. So we're going to talk about how Enlightenment thinkers shaped the American political philosophy. And we have, again, one of our key guests, Dr. Carice, back with us. Dr. Carice, thank you so much. So again, the question today is, how did the Enlightenment thinkers shape American political philosophy?
Thank you, Liz. Yet again, an important question. One way to think about America's political philosophy from the founding period, let's say the 1770s, forward, is to be aware of multiple influences from traditions or schools of thought. America is a complicated story. Use whatever metaphor you want, a mosaic or just think more than one idea needing to blend and balance with others. And the Americans wanted to do this. So one thing to remember, and Alexis de Tocqueville, this great French jurist and scholar who comes to visit a half century after the founding in the 1830s, he says that America is a very religious, biblical Christian country. So we shouldn't forget that we don't think of that as a philosophy or a school of thought, but that's deeply shaping American thinking about politics and justice. And then we've talked about this in other episodes, the common law tradition, the English mode of thinking about the law and courts and judges, and even in a bigger sense, a constitution of government, the common law tradition. That's an important influence. The colleges that are in America at the middle of the 18th century, so young men like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, et cetera, and the name of the list goes on, they are studying classical and some medieval philosophy, a liberal arts education in the colleges. So those are all influences on the men who are debating ideas at the First Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress about the Declaration, leading to the Declaration, then the framing of the Articles of Confederation, the framing of the Constitution, right? But now your question, right? What about this mode of philosophy or thinking called the Enlightenment, this modern way of thinking? Yes, very important. So I'm trying to be very American in saying both and, right? Which is more important than the other? And my answer is yes, right? So it's a great ongoing debate among scholars. Which of these modes of thinking, sources of thinking is most important? So the Enlightenment is important to understand. Modern philosophers, let's say roughly from the late 17th century, I'm going to say John Locke is on the early side of the Enlightenment, okay? Not the earliest, but early side of the Enlightenment. Modern philosophers on political and social thought, they eventually start to refer to themselves, or this is an idea, enlightenment, and these are Enlightenment philosophers, right? So very important, and now I'm going to make a second suggestion. There are two main strands to think about influencing the American founders, two strands of the Enlightenment. Scholars refer to them as the radical Enlightenment and the moderate Enlightenment. Okay. One way to think about this, not to confuse things too much, is think about the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, right? One revolution, the American Revolution, retains basically the common law constitutionalism, practices of self-government, institution of self-government that the American colonists are taking from Britain. A moderate revolution. It's not radical to the Latin root there is to the root, right? It's not overthrowing everything and starting from fresh. The French Revolution starts moderate and goes radical, right? So there, and the more radical ideas of the Enlightenment dominate in the French Revolution. Okay, so radical and moderate is a way that scholars think about the Enlightenment philosophers. Which sort of flavor is this? What strand is it? And my way of defining the moderate Enlightenment, and I'm not alone in this, is this idea of blending. The moderate Enlightenment philosophers, I'm going to pick Montesquieu as the most prominent moderate Enlightenment philosopher, writing in the middle of the 18th century, his big book, The Spirit of Laws. We've talked about him before. He blends modern ideas, his awareness of other Enlightenment philosophers, including John Locke, with some classical and medieval Christian philosophy, Greek and Roman and Christian philosophy, blended in with modern ideas, and blends in the common law, the branch of it that's on the continent, so to speak, in Europe and France and in England. All that in a blend. That's the moderation part. Moderation meaning avoiding extremes by blending and balancing principles. Okay. All right. And then just one other point. I would say the three most important Enlightenment philosophers for the American founding, or modes of Enlightenment thinking. Most important, I mentioned Locke already, John Locke, and we'll talk more about him. I mentioned Montesquieu, French philosopher. So we've got an English philosopher, John Locke, French philosopher, Montesquieu, and now I'm going to mention a third, and it's more than one Enlightenment thinker, the Scottish Enlightenment, it's called. Philosophers in Scotland. Probably the best known to our audience of listeners would be Adam Smith, who we think of as an economist. He's a professor of moral philosophy, economist. David Hume. And a third, it's a group of them, a common sense school of philosophy. Maybe the most famous one is Reid. And the phrase in the Declaration of Independence about self-evident truths comes from this school of common sense philosophy in the Scottish Enlightenment. Okay? So those are three. And Locke, I think of as more on the radical side. He's not as radical as, say, a figure like Spinoza or an earlier modern philosopher. But Locke has some pretty radical ideas. What do I mean by that? Emphasis on new ideas, new philosophy, new thinking. Think of the social contract, right? That's an emphasis on the new making of a social order based on his new principles of individual natural rights. Okay? It's not explicitly anti-tradition. It's not explicitly calling for a revolution against the English form of government, but it leans toward the radical side. Don't be simply trusting of traditional thought, of classical thought, of medieval Christian thought. Be aware of this new power that philosophers have to think new thoughts about what is justice and what's required of justice. So there's a big argument for you that take our two most important documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, and thinking about the relationship between them. We need to be aware of these more moderate Enlightenment elements and the radical Enlightenment elements, informing them. And then the story, of course, doesn't stop there. It goes on for 200 plus years afterward.
So, Dr. Cruz, you and I have talked a lot about the Declaration of Independence. So looking at that declaration, how do you see both the radical and the moderate strands of the Enlightenment philosophy within the document?
Great. And we've suggested to listeners, always have your pocket constitution handy with your copy of the Declaration. So if you have your copy of the Declaration in front of you in a pocket constitution, it's only 5 or 6 pages or something like that. The bulk of the document is the English common law way of thinking about not just law in a narrow sense, but larger ideas of a constitution of free government and principles of law. I mean, the separation of powers is embedded in there in all those charges. So that's a sign of the moderate Enlightenment, because there are radical Enlightenment dimensions, obviously, and those are now the most famous parts of the Declaration, right? The phrase I was just mentioning, the second paragraph, right? Mm-hmm. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, that's Scottish Enlightenment, but then the Lockean parts, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That secure these rights, government's established. And hey, you've got not just a right, but a duty to revolt against the government that you've proven over time. It's proven over time it's not securing these rights. It's not abiding by these rights. So there's a radical, Enlightenment idea right at the beginning. But the bulk of the document shows the moderate Enlightenment influence. We're going to mix traditional common law, ideas going back hundreds of years, with these new Lockean radical Enlightenment ideas. And then two other points. Right there at the beginning, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness shows, I think, a moderate Enlightenment dimension, because it's not Locke's phrasing life, liberty, property as the three individual, and there are more than those rights, but among these three, right? Pursuit of happiness is a more classical idea. It's still used by Enlightenment philosophers, but more emphatically used by the more moderate Enlightenment philosophers. This is the point of government for people, for a just form of government. Government is meant to just provide the security and the foundations for life beyond government. Pursuit of happiness in this broader sense. Okay, and then a final point, the references to a divinity. And I'm going to say there are 4 references to divinity, and there's a 4.5. Okay, so there are literally four references. Endowed by the Creator, capital C is the first one. Then 3 others, laws of nature and nature's God in the first paragraph. Okay, and then 2 in the final paragraph. Appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, appealing to the protection of divine providence. Okay, 4.5 is the very last 2 words of the Declaration: sacred honor. So there's the moderate Enlightenment. You have references to divinity in an active way. This is not just some abstract deist idea of we find laws of nature out there by reason. This is a God who cares, a person, a being who cares, and you could appeal to this God for the rectitude of our intentions and protection of divine providence, right? And then to have the word honor in there is not a radical Enlightenment idea. It's not a modern, radical, new, cutting-edge idea. It's an old idea. It's a classical idea. It's a medieval idea, monarchy, aristocracy, and certain kinds of republic. To say it's a matter of sacred honor to stand for these principles, right? We mutually pledge our lives, our fortunes. Those are material, right? But the lives are actually metaphysical because they're involved with sacred honor. Okay? There's complexity for you. If there's several ideas, we got to figure out how to blend and balance them together. That's the moderate Enlightenment influence.
So then looking at the Constitution, how do you see Montesquieu's philosophy and the moderate strand of the Enlightenment philosophy becoming more predominant? So this blend of modern philosophy and law with the more classical and medieval ideas.
Yes, the Constitution is most influenced by Montesquieu, and I'll call him a protege of Montesquieu's, an English jurist named William Blackstone, who cites Montesquieu when Blackstone writes his 4-volume work, Commentaries on the Laws of England. And we know, scholars know, that if you think about all the references to Enlightenment or modern philosophers in the period from the 1770s to 1800, Montesquieu is referred to more than any other single philosopher. From the period of the Declaration through to the Constitution, through the ratification of the Bill of Rights. And then these main principles of Montesquieu's view of a moderate, he uses the phrase, a moderate government that will protect people to be free and secure. It could be a constitutional monarchy. It could be a kind of republic. He's not strict about that. But his big principles are the big principles of our Constitution: separation of powers and federalism, especially for federalism for republics. And it's the 3-part separation of powers: legislative power, an executive power. Now, Locke has those in his philosophy, but then an independent judiciary, which Locke does not have in the second treatise of government. And then another thing that Locke doesn't have, this principle of complexity and balancing and trying to avoid extremes. And Montesquieu says the English have come up with a wise idea. You have a separate legislature and you split it in two. You have an upper house and a lower house, right? So in a way, with the modern Enlightenment, the more complicated, the better. That's going a little too far. But they like this idea with ideas and with institutions to have complexity. Okay? And again, Tocqueville can see when he comes in Rights and Democracy in America in the 1830s, that the Americans have a complex constitutional form of government, federalism and separation of powers, and they have this complex moral, intellectual culture that's informing this. And he refers to the title of the book is Democracy in America, but he really argues we are a constitutional republic with a democratic spirit to it. Mm-hmm. But we've talked about this before. America is a constitutional democratic republic, right? That whole complex package and the complexity of our Constitution, federalism and separation of powers, is very Montesquieuan, very moderate Enlightenment. And here's Tocqueville after the Enlightenment looking back and saying, this is good, this is successful. I have some worries about it, but America being a republic with a democratic spirit, he really likes that. America having a strong constitutionalism. And here I should say, this is coming from Montesquieu, it's accurate to call us a republic, we've talked about this, because think of offices like the Senate, which is not directly elected by the people in the original version and has special powers, right? The single executive, president, the judges who aren't elected at all in any way, right? They're selected by the non-elected Senate and the non-democratically elected Senate and non-democratically elected president, right? So Tocqueville looks at this after 50 years, this is a good idea to have these high Republican offices blended with a more democratic office institution like the House, blended with the state governments, which are more small d democratic, government close to the people. And all of that blend, that complex constitutionalism, Tocqueville likes it. That's going to get you a better guarantee of sustainable government that provides for liberty with enough order, provides for a principle of equality, but with still some order and room for expertise and rational argument. So that's the moderate Enlightenment showing up in the Constitution and our complex constitutional order.
So what you're saying is Enlightenment thinkers did shape the American political philosophy in many different ways. Like, it's not as linear as we would like it to be. I mean, it's complicated, but there are so many both radical and moderate strands of those Enlightenment philosophies and thinkers within the Declaration and the Constitution.
That's right. And a background thought here to close, if you are disposed to be proud of, happy with, grateful for the American founding and its principles and our Constitution, great. If you're disposed to be critical, it's flawed, it's fraudulent, fine. Either way, in this sense, either way, you've got thinking to do. Because we know that there were these complicated ways of putting together different influences of thought. And there's a very serious philosophy, classical and medieval and modern, being read. And so whether you like it or you don't like it, the American founding and our Constitution, either way, you have some studying to do.
Dr. Kreis, as always, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.